Many of the Hebrew prophets are quoted in gospel text. Gospel authors appeal to their prediction. Gospel narratives quote from their words. But only one prophet from the storied text of the Hebrew Bible was expected and predicted to return. And according to the Gospels, he did. His name was Elijah. I'm Ross Nichols for HOREB Institute, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is Sunday School. So today we're going to talk about Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu HaTishbi, Elijah the prophet, Elijah the Tishbite. By the way, what is a Tishbite? We're going to have to get into that. I wish I could tell you to open your Bible to the book of Elijah, but as you know, there is no book of Elijah. There's no book, a collection of his prophecies, of his life and times like we have with so many of the other prophets. But in a way, and this is what I really want to drill down on, Elijah was one of the first, if not the first. We're going to talk about this. Elijah was one of the early prophets. Now, when I say that Elijah in some ways is first, let me qualify that as we get into the material today. So the first thing that I would say is we do have the appearance of various prophets before Elijah. We have the appearance of Ahijah in 1 Kings 11 and so forth. But I'm talking about a significant character in the Hebrew Bible. We also have all the way back in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 7, there's this odd reference, seems a little bit out of place, where it refers to Abraham as Hanavi, as a prophet. But this is interesting, and it's clearly later interpolated into the text, because if we read 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 9, it says that formerly, meaning prior to the monarchy, one who had this special relationship, this special gift, wasn't referred to as a prophet. So clearly the text in Genesis chapter 20 is an edited text. But even more important than this is an idea that I want to begin to develop in this class that I would call the northern prophets, okay? We're talking about a group of prophets of which Elijah and his successor Elisha are part of. And when I say the northern prophets, I mean prophets whose primary work and ministry, if you want to call it that, are taking place in regions that are considered the northern kingdom of Israel. So we're going to see that this plays out, and we're going to see how very important it is to distinguish between the northern prophets and the southern prophets. Now, when I talk about the northern prophets, and you'll see this as we get more and more into the study, I'm talking Elijah and Elisha primarily, and then there are three literary prophets, meaning prophets that have their own book, that are also considered northern prophets. That is, they may spend time in the southern kingdom, but their primary focus is on the events going on in the north. And that would be Jonah the prophet, Amos, and Hosea. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on each of these as we work through the study. But today, we're focused on Elijah. Now, let me just give you this brief rundown. One of the things that's important, if you look chronologically, we've done classes, we've taught sessions where we show that they're not necessarily, the prophetic books are not necessarily in chronological order. But if I were to order chronologically the prophets, it would begin with, when I'm talking about literary prophets, prophets with books, you would have Jonah, Amos, and Hosea. These are among the earliest. And then as you work your way down, you would have part of Isaiah chapter 1 through 33. That text, that group of text is associated with the 8th century prophet, the son of Amos, that we meet with in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1. So the first part of Isaiah would be next. And then we would have Micah and Nahum around the same time. Then we would get into Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those are all grouped towards the end of the First Temple period. Obadiah, the latter part of Isaiah, primarily chapter 34 onward. Some would say from chapter 40 on. That's debated. But either way, the material is reflecting that later period. Haggai, Zechariah, chapter 1 through 8, and then chapters 9 through 14 are believed by many scholars to be a later addition that's associated with the first part. And then Joel and Malachi taking up the end. So in some ways, the prophets begin with Elijah. And that's where our class is going to focus today. Elijah, in some ways, is sort of ahead of a prophetic stream. Now, according to what we can determine in the text, we're going to deal with what we can know and what we think we can know. From what we know from the text, if you read the narratives that we're going to get into today, or at least begin to get into, most would date Elijah's time frame roughly from 870 to 850 BCE, right? So it's primarily the time of Ahab, Ahaziah, and into the reign of Joram. So we're dealing with the 9th century BCE. Now, one of the main points that I want to establish when we get going with this is that this is 130 years before we get to Isaiah. So the northern prophets are active way before we read anything from the pen of a southern prophet. And there are other major distinctions between the northern prophets and the southern prophets. Now, the last prophetic book or the last prophetic book associated with prophecy is Malachi. And Malachi is going to close with Elijah. So I want you to understand that I'm basically giving us and talking about the bookends, the same figure. So we begin with Elijah all the way back in 1 Kings 17, and then we work our way through the end of the prophets, and at the end of Malachi, Elijah comes again, or at least a prediction of his coming again. So that between the first mention of Elijah and the close of the prophetic canon, if I can call it that, is roughly 4 centuries. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that the first was mentioned by the last. Do that, or do with that as you will. Most of what we know about Elijah comes from a small, incomplete collection of stories that date to the 9th century. Now, why do I say it's incomplete? It clearly drops us into the story, and it's not the way that many of these stories begin. We pick up with Elijah, and you can tell that that's not necessarily the beginning of the story. Now, again, this is set in the northern kingdom, not in the south. However, Elijah, according to the biblical text, makes his way around a good bit. We see him primarily dealing with the kingdom of the north. So we're dealing with the kingdom of Ahab and Ahaziah and Joram. He's in the region of the northern kingdom. But we also find Elijah going to the coast, along the coast on the western side of your map. We also see him operating in what is called Gilead, or the Transjordan, east of the Jordan Rift, east of the Jordan River. But we're also going to encounter some of the Elijah story takes place in the wilderness, and particularly in a place called HOREB. Notice that when we encounter Elijah at HOREB, which we're going to get into in a little bit, it's not called Sinai. That's a later priestly way to describe the mountain of God, but it's called HOREB, which I find quite interesting. Now, the Elijah cycle of stories that I mentioned a few minutes ago, when we deal with the Elijah cycle of stories, we're basically dealing with 4 sets of text, 4 groupings or narrative blocks that come to us from 1st and 2nd Kings. And here they are, so that you can put these in your notes. These are the 4 main narrative blocks for the story of Elijah the prophet. 1 Kings 17:1 through 18:46. This is a major section dealing with the career, the life and times of Elijah the prophet. Next, we have chapter 19, verses 1 through 21. Then we have chapter 21, verses 1 through 29, and 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 11. Again, these are 4 narrative blocks. They're spread across 6 chapters. You can see those in your notes in 1 Kings 17, 18, 19, 21, 2 Kings chapter 1, and 2 Kings chapter 2. The name Elijah appears in the Hebrew Bible 62 times. Now, interestingly enough, we have 2 different spellings for the name Elijah. When I opened, I referred to Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi. You'll hear the sacred name Iyahu on the end, Eliyahu. All right, and that is the way that we encounter it in almost all of the text. But there are about 5 texts in 2 Kings chapter 1, which I don't know why this is. It could be that this is by the pen of a later scribe. Maybe it's updated. But we see a different spelling in the following text. And these verses will not be on the screen, but they'll be in the chat. It's 2 Kings chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, 2 Kings chapter 1 and verse 8, verse 12 of 2 Kings chapter 1, and then the final occurrence of this form of the prophet's name is in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 23 in the Hebrew. If you're in the English, it's going to be chapter 4 and verse 5. The reason I bring this up is because in those examples, the name is not rendered Eliyahu, but Eliah. Eliah. Both of these are related. Obviously, they both have the theophoric element of the name, meaning there is an element to the god Yah or Yahu. And both of those are different forms of the same name and different spellings. Now, one of the things that's interesting is there's no need to worry about that because we see that also with David. Sometimes David is spelled one way, sometimes it's spelled another. We call this full spelling or deficient, basically. At times it will have a vowel letter and at times it won't. This is a little bit different. However, I wanted to bring this up because we're going to encounter a prophecy at the end of the book of prophets, at the end of the book of Malachi, and the name there is not Eliyahu, but it's Eliah. Now, some have wondered if that's the same, and the reason I'm bringing up these 5 texts is that it is a different form of the same name, referencing the prophet that we're going to talk about in this class. Now, there are 4 other texts which mention Elijah outside of those 4 major groupings that we posted on the screen a few moments ago. And here they are, just very high level. I'm not going to post these. I'm just going to give them to you. In 2 Kings chapter 3, it refers to Elisha, the successor to Elijah, and it says that he was the one who served Elijah. So there is a reference there to Elijah. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 9 and 10, there are 2 references pointing back to certain things that Elijah predicted, and in these texts, it's talking about the fulfillment of his prophecy at an earlier time. And then, as I mentioned, and we'll get into this later, Malachi chapter 3 in Hebrew, Malachi chapter 4, there is this one standalone, very interesting prophecy about a return of Elijah. Now, I want to begin with the 1 Kings chapter 17. We're going to talk about what we know about the prophet Elijah. 1 Kings chapter 17, and I just want to read the first verse to kind of kick things off. It says, "And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the sojourners of Gilead, said unto Ahab, as Jehovah the God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years according to my word." This is where we meet with Elijah the prophet. He comes out swinging, and at this point, we know nothing of Elijah. We've never heard of Elijah. We've also never heard of a Tishbite, but that's for just a few minutes from now. Here's what we don't know. We don't know his lineage. Is he a priest? We don't know. We never get that information. In fact, what I find interesting is that it says that, if I read it, Elijah the Tishbite is what the text says in the ASV. And in the Hebrew, it's pretty close, right? In other words, it says, and Elijah, Vayomer Eliyahu HaTishbi. Elijah, and Elijah said. In the Hebrew, it's kind of interesting, but let me make this point very clearly. We don't know where Tishbe is. Now, if you look at a map, it's going to put it in Gilead, right? So most Bible maps will put a dot and say Tishbe with a question mark, Tishbe, question mark. And the reason there's a question mark is we don't know where that is. Now, the way that the Hebrew is preserved, according to the Masoretic text, the way that it's pointed, I've looked at it. I've tried to figure out something else that it might be other than a place. In other words, my first thought when I read this, and I know that there's no one else from Tishbe. It's never mentioned except in context associated with Elijah. So I thought, well, maybe it means something else. But all my research thus far has not convinced me to think of it any other way. But we don't know where it is. What we do know, and the reason most people put it east of the Jordan in Gilead with a question mark, is because that it says Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the sojourners of Gilead. Now remember, I said we don't know his lineage. We don't know his mother, his father, his family, what tribe he's from. And get ready. Look, I almost didn't say this, but we don't even know if he's Israelite. He is of the sojourners. Now, here's something interesting. In Hebrew, it says, Eliyahu HaTishbi mi Toshaveh. Now, the reason I said that in Hebrew is because you might hear Tishbi and Toshav. They both have the same root letters. Tav, Shin, Beit. This means that the word for Tishbe, that's supposedly a place name, is the same root consonants as the word sojourners. So what am I saying? He is the Tishbite, whatever that means, wherever that is, if it's a place, and he is of the sojourners of Gilead. Now, what is a sojourner? A sojourner is not an Israelite. A sojourner is rooted to the idea of toshav in Hebrew. Toshav is a resident, a dweller, but an outsider. It's someone who is not part of a people. Now, they have they're less integrated, they have less rights, So it's just a question. It's a puzzle. The bottom line is that Elijah is from a group of people east of the Jordan Rift in the land of Gilead, and he's part of a bigger group of outsiders. Now, I find this to be interesting. Now, there are a couple of other people, before you get upset, there are a couple of other people in the biblical text who become big figures in the grand scheme of things, but they're not really of the resident people of the land. I'll give you one example. How about Abraham? Look with me at Genesis chapter 23. Genesis chapter 23. And we're going to go to verse 4, where it says, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. You remember, this is where Abraham is trying to bargain with the children of Heth, the Hittites, if you will, for a burial place for his wife Sarah, who's died. Now, it's interesting, and I wanted to make this point, is that Abraham is in fact referred to as a sojourner, and there the word again is toshav. In fact, it says ger v'toshav. I am a stranger, ger, and a toshav, and a sojourner, meaning an outsider who's living among you, right? Now, there are a couple of other texts that I want to look at quickly, and these are quite instructive as well. Look with me we're going to look at Leviticus chapter 25. This is our first one, Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 23. And here it says, and the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for ye are strangers and sojourners with me. So even the children of Israel, if it upsets you that I said we don't even know if Elijah is Israelite, and we don't, right? Not at least based on the information that we have. But here it says that the children of Israel, according to God, that they are sojourners with God in the land. Now, look at one more with me. Look at Psalm 39. Psalm 39, and it's verse 12 in the English, and verse 13 in the Hebrew. It says, hear my prayer. This is a psalm of David, by the way. O Jehovah, and give ear unto my cry. Hold not thy peace at my tears, for I am a stranger with thee, a sojourner as all my fathers were. So there's this idea that we get from the Hebrew text that the Israelites are sojourners. And we get this idea, when we get to Deuteronomy once, it talks about how his father was a wandering Aramaean, right? Someone who was not native to the land at the beginning, but God put them in that place. So we don't really know, when it comes to Elijah, what it means to be a Tishbite. If it's a location, we don't really know where it is. It's a good guess to put it in the land of Gilead, because whatever Tishbite means, Hatishbi, that's where he's at, and he's with the sojourners of Gilead. Now, by the way, in the chat, we'll have a few other texts that you can look at on your own and follow through with various texts that are associated with being a toshav. And there's 7 texts, I believe, that you can look at. Now, another interesting thing that I want to begin to talk about when it comes to both Elijah and his successor, these are among the early prophets. They are also both miracle workers. That's right. A lot of people, when they look at the Gospels, remember, a lot of this is to set us up to take a good and careful and honest look at the gospel text. A lot of people, when they look at the gospel text, they encounter miraculous things. And some giggle and make fun and they don't believe. But here's the point that I want to show. The gospel writers didn't make that up. It's not just the gospels that have miracles, but I can tell you where you won't find many miracles. And that's in the texts that are associated with the southern prophets. You get a couple here and there. But when you want to talk about the prophets who are going to be associated with the miraculous, it's primarily going to be the northern prophets. Let me give you a couple of examples, and some of you probably know some of these off the top of your head. Elijah was in control of the weather. Elijah stopped the rain. We read it in 1 Kings 17. He stops the rain, and it's not allowed, or God will not allow, rain to come again for more than 3 years until Elijah lets the clouds let loose. Remember the story where the small cloud the size of a man's hand. But he controls the elements according to the sacred historians. Now, if you don't believe in miracles, you don't believe in miracles. But I want you to understand that when we're dealing with prophets who are performing miracles, you got to look to the north. That's where the miraculous stories. It's almost as if you read miraculous, you read prophets who are performing miracles, you're in a genre of the northern prophets, not in the south. Elijah called down fire from heaven. Remember, he has this big battle with the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah, and he calls down fire from heaven. The fire comes down according to the text, according to our sacred historians, and consumes the sacrifice and so forth. How about this one? The prophet Elijah and Elisha as well, they have the ability to miraculously multiply food. Now, remember, we're going to encounter some of these same kind of stories in the gospel text. So some, obviously, might say, well, of course we're going to encounter them in the gospel text because they're copying, this is what some would say, they're copying from the template from the prophets, the Hebrew prophets. But what I would say is there's something bigger going on here. It has to do with the type of literature, at least in part, that we're dealing with when we encounter these gospel stories. What we're dealing with is northern prophet material. Whether you believe it or not is a whole nother question. So they multiply food. How about this one? Raising the dead. Raising the dead. We're going to see that. Now, what I find interesting is where else we see these types of stories, which this is all part of preparing us for that adventure. Now, the question again comes down to, are these accounts historical? Well, it depends on what you call historical, because some would argue that there's no way. What I would suggest is that that's not the question I'm asking. What I'm looking at is the fact that these stories preserved in the Elijah-Elisha cycle of readings and the stories that are recorded in the gospel narratives are northern prophet material. And that's why you see these stories. It's as if there is a template behind both of these. Now, the tradition runs like this, and this is what we're going to flesh out, if you will, over the next several classes. We have it runs from Elijah to Elisha to John to Jesus. Now, what is quite fascinating, and we'll see this over and over, and very few people point this out, is not only do we have similar miracles, the raising of the dead, the multiplication of food, but it's where the story takes place. we're going to see some of these taking place in the same place, almost the same town. Interesting. Now, there's one side note, and I put this in the notes, but I'm going to develop this further in a future class. But here's something that I noticed. I have this stack of papers of notes that I'm working on for future classes. And one of the things that I notice about Elijah, because I'm looking for things that might be similar in the gospel narratives. And something hit me the other day as I was reading the story of Elijah. Now, Elijah challenges, is one way to put it, or condemns Ahab and Jezebel. Now, where does this take place? Again, northern kingdom. A king, a ruler of the north, and his wicked wife Jezebel. We still use that phrase to refer to, not that it's nice to do this, but if you had someone who was a woman who was really, really a bad character, we still talk about her as a Jezebel. In fact, some circles talk about a Jezebel spirit. Well, it's interesting that Elijah confronts Ahab and Jezebel in the north. When we get to the John the Baptist connections, which I'll fully develop in a later class, John the Baptist condemns Herod Antipas and Herodias. Now, Antipas is over Galilee and Perea. Now, that's not in the south, right? He's dealing specifically. I think there's a connection there we have to develop. Both Jezebel and Herodias want to kill the prophet, plug in. You either plug in Elijah or John. These two women, the wife of the northern ruler, want to kill the prophet. And then we also get this interesting correlation that Elijah, when the wife wants to kill him, when Jezebel wants to kill him, Ahab is a little uneasy about this. And you look at the story of when John the Baptist, when his life is threatened, Antipas seems to be a little bit fearful about this thing. Again, we're going to go through a lot of this and dig deeper in this detail, but I just want to say that when you look at the stories, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the gospel text, you see that there are many similarities, whether intended, whether forced, different people are going to view this different ways. Now, another interesting thing that I don't know if you've thought about this way, but Elijah is in some ways a prophet like Moses. Elijah is a prophet like Moses. Now, how is Elijah a prophet like Moses? Well, for starters, both, and you may think of some on your own, but both Moses and Elijah encounter God at HOREB. And they also reportedly both associated with this encounter fast 40 days and 40 nights. So the first thing I want to do is I want to establish that both of these, Elijah and Moses, encounter God at a place called HOREB. Go with me. We have two texts, Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1, and 1 Kings chapter 19. So let's go to Exodus 3:1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the wilderness and came to the mountain of God unto HOREB. And then it talks about the angel of Jehovah appeared to him in a flame of fire, etc. By the way, this back and forth, who's in the bush? Is it the angel of the Lord? Is it the Lord himself? Is it God? The different terms are used in this text, and we find something similar in Kings. But look with me now at 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 8. And actually, let me back up to verse 7 to give you a little more context. And the angel of Jehovah came again a second time and touched him, this is Elijah, and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. And he arose and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, I don't want to understate the importance, based on the sacred historian, that the place is called Horeb, and it's qualified with the phrase, the mountain of God. Later priestly writers will prefer, and we see this very clearly indicated in the text in the Pentateuch, that you have primarily Deuteronomy is going to refer to the place as Horeb. That was it's also the name of the place that is in the Moses Scroll. Most of you know about the Moses Scroll. Link also for that book is in the comments, but just so, or in the description. But Horeb is the name that Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomist, if you will, the editor of this work, prefers to say Horeb and not Sinai. So I find that to be particularly interesting. Also, the fact that Elijah, like Moses before him, not only encountered God at this place, which is a ways from where Elijah is normally operating. He has to go on a long journey to get there. The next thing that I want to look at is the fact that both fasted for 40 days. Now, I just gave you the one in 1 Kings where it says that Elijah went 40 days and 40 nights on the food that the angel gave him. Now, this time I want you to go with me to Exodus 34 and verse 28. I've got a few verses here that are relative to the point. And he, Moses, was there with Jehovah 40 days and 40 nights. He did eat neither bread nor drink water, and he wrote upon the tables the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. Now, I'm going to pick up two more, even though I have more than that on the screen. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 9. It says, When I was gone up into the mount to receive the tables of stone, even the tables of the covenant which Jehovah made with you, then I abode in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. I did eat neither bread nor drink water. And then go down to verse 18, and this will be the last to make this point. And I fell down before Jehovah as at the first. 40 days and 40 nights I did neither eat bread nor drink water, because of all your sin which you sinned in doing that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah, to provoke him to anger. So we have both Moses and Elijah encountering God at Horeb, the mount of God, and that encounter is associated with a fast of neither eating bread or water for 40 days. Now, the next thing that I find interesting in connecting Elijah with Moses is that they both do a miracle of dividing the water. Go with me to Exodus chapter 14, Exodus 14, and beginning in verse 15. And Jehovah said unto Moses, Wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel that they go forward, and lift thou up thy rod, and stretch out thy hand over the sea, and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go into the midst of the sea on dry ground. Now look down at verse 21, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Jehovah caused the sea to go out back by a strong east wind all the night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Now, this is not the class. I've done this in other classes. What body of water are we talking about? Also, when you look at this particular miracle of dividing water, Joshua, when he crosses the Jordan, it says that he performed a miracle and divided the water similar to what Moses had done, and that's the Jordan River. Well, guess who else divides the Jordan River? Go with me to 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 8. 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 8 says the following. And Elijah took his mantle, wrapped it together, and smote the waters, and they were divided hither and thither, so that they too went over on dry ground. Now, the reason that I bring these points up is that I find it quite striking. There's actually more than these. We'll get to those in a moment. But let me just say, both of these prophets, Moses and Elijah, are both last seen in the land of Moab. Both are last seen in the land of Moab. Now, they're across, not just in the land of Moab are they last seen. They're directly across from Gilgal and Jericho. Now, that's kind of interesting. So I want you to look with me at 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 9. Just look down. In fact, let me just say, if we go back to verse 1, we're going to delve into the text on the screen, but in 2 Kings 2:1, it says, "And it came to pass when Jehovah would take up Elijah by a whirlwind into heaven, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal." Now, we're going to follow Elijah and Elisha. Gilgal, in the biblical text, is close. It's on the western side of the Jordan. You find this on your map, right around Jericho. So they're going to go from Gilgal to Bethel. Now, Bethel takes them west. So they're going to go from east to west, from Gilgal to Bethel, or Bethel. And then from Bethel, they're going to go to Jericho, Gilgal, to the same region. So now they're going from west to east. And then they're going to actually cross over the Jordan, and this is what I find interesting. So look with me, 2 Kings 2, let's pick it up at verse 9. Now remember, in verse 8, the two of them, Elijah and Elisha, went over on dry ground. Where are they? Well, clearly they're in the land of Moab, directly across from Gilgal and Jericho. Verse 9, "And it came to pass when they were gone over," meaning they're in the land of Moab, "that Elijah said unto Elisha, Ask what I shall do for thee before I am taken from thee. And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And he said, Thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I'm taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee. But if not, it shall not be so. It came to pass, as they still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, which parted them both asunder. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes and rent them in two pieces. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. So now he's going from east to west. He's coming back to the water. And he took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and smote the waters and said, Where is Jehovah, the God of Elijah? And when he also had smitten the waters, they were divided hither and thither, and Elisha went over. So now we've got a new, seemingly, prophet like Moses, one that is performing these miracles. In this case, particularly, the dividing of the water. But remember, one of the keys that I want you to get is that Elijah is last seen. And it just says Elisha didn't see him ever again. He's taken up in a whirlwind, right? Chariots of fire. Now look with me at Deuteronomy chapter 34, beginning in verse 1. Deuteronomy 34 and verse 1. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab. This is the area, right? Get this, geography. You got to do geography. Unto Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. He's right across from Jericho. This, if you're Moses and you're looking over, if he looked down, he's going to see where the chariots swoop down. You know the old spiritual. swing low. I won't do that to you, but you get the idea. And Jehovah showed him all the land of Gilead. So he's looking, he sees Gilead, he sees Dan and Naphtali and Ephraim and Manasseh and all the land of Judah and the hinder sea and the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees unto Zoar. So now he's looking that way. And Jehovah said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham and Isaac and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of Jehovah, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of Jehovah. Now, where is he dying? Is he on the top of Pisgah? No. Keep reading. And he buried him, or where is he buried? We don't know, but it says, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, over against Beit Peor, but no man knows of his sepulchre unto this day. So the sacred historian says we started with what is a Tishbite, or where is Tishbe? And it's in the land of Gilead, I guess, but it's on that eastern side of the Jordan. This is going to be very important. It's also going to be very important in our gospel studies. But I want you to get oriented. Now, whenever you think about Moses and Elijah and their last scene in this same geographical location, that to me is quite interesting. In 2 Kings 2:14, Elisha asked a question. Where is Jehovah, the God of Elijah? I'm going to reverse that question for you. Where is the Elijah of God? Where is Elijah? He's last seen in a fiery chariot, and that's it. We don't know. There is a letter that we'll talk about later, maybe in the after class, a letter that Elijah wrote. It appears in the Chronicles, the Divrei Hayamim, but we'll talk about that later. But where does he go? And he didn't die. I mean, according to the sacred historian, he's right there with Elisha, and the chariot swoops down and picks him up. Now I want you to go with me to the book of Malachi, the last of the prophets. I want you to go to Malachi, and I want to pick up in chapter 3, verse 22. Or in the English, it's going to be chapter 4, verse 4. This is where I want to start reading. And by the way, this is after a major break. So when I teach, you'll hear me talk about white spaces in the prophets and so forth. It's because you're to understand a certain pericope, a certain saying, as being together. And so after 22, or after verse 21 or verse 3 in the English, it's a new section. This goes together. Here we go. Remember ye the Torah, the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded unto him in HOREB for all Israel, even statutes and ordinances. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of Jehovah come. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. In Hebrew, a herem. Devotion to destruction. But I want you to understand that you can't just read, if you want to understand what Malachi wants us to get. There's this encouragement, this command to remember the Torah of Moses, which he commanded him at HOREB, and you can't just look at that by itself, because what's associated with that is God says it's a promise. I will send the prophet Elijah before the great coming day of the Lord. Now, remember earlier I said most often of the 62 references to the name Elijah, it's almost exclusively Eliyahu. But here, it matches what we found in 2 Kings chapter 1, 5 times. We saw Eliah. I believe that this indicates that that was from a later pen. It's been updated, just like Malachi is the latest. So we see that Eliah is coming again. Now, what I also find interesting about this text is that the sacred historian wants us to put Moses and Elijah together. We have Moses and Elijah, we have a mountain, we have HOREB mentioned. Quite interesting. Now, the gospel writers, writing in the same method, drawing on the same stories and making connections that many people miss in English, they will also put Moses and Elijah together. Many of you will recall in the Gospels, and these texts will be in the chat, Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 3, Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 4, and Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 31. All of these tell the story, the synoptic accounts of the so-called transfiguration. And I find it interesting that there you have Moses and Elijah and Jesus. And just as a side note, which we'll get into later, remember we're talking about these miracles and how the writers want to make certain associations for us as if to say, look, this means more than you see on the surface. We have that Jesus also is said, according to our gospel accounts, to have fasted 40 days and 40 nights. Now, a question arises when we talk about Malachi. I've been saying Malachi is the last of the prophets, but is Malachi a prophet? Is there a prophet named Malachi? That's the question I'm getting to. Look with me at Malachi chapter 1, verse 1. Malachi chapter 1 and verse 1. And it says in the ASV, the burden of the word of Jehovah to Israel by Malachi. In Hebrew, it's by the hand of B'yad Malachi. Now, that doesn't have to be a personal name. In fact, it's not translated as a personal name in other places in this very book. In other words, it could be the burden of the word of Jehovah to Israel by the hand of my messenger, because malak means messenger. You've heard in previous classes, we've talked about the angel of the Lord is the malak Yehovah, right? So if we have the malak, the messenger, the question is, who is the messenger? Is this a person? Now, I think that my messenger here is not the name of a person. Various people think differently, but most of the academics will say that this is to be considered generic. Might be specific, might be referring to a specific messenger, and I believe it is, but it's certainly not a name. Malachi. Malak means messenger. That's really all it means. The word angel is derivative and so forth, but malak means messenger. So here, this is the word, the burden, the oracle of the word of the Lord to my messenger. The question is, who is God's messenger? Who is God's messenger? Now I want you to go with me to chapter 3 of Malachi, beginning in verse 1. Notice, it says in 3:1, behold, I send my messenger. In Hebrew, it says Malachi. Same as we found in verse 1. Behold, I send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord, Ha'adon, whom ye seek, will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant whom ye desire, behold, he cometh, saith Jehovah of hosts. But who can abide the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appeareth? For he's like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. And he will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them as gold and silver. And they shall offer unto Jehovah offerings in righteousness. Then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto Jehovah, as in the days of old and as in ancient years. And I will come near to you in judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against adulterers, and against the false swearers, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow, the fatherless, that turn aside the sojourner from his right. And fear not me, saith Jehovah of hosts. 4. I, Jehovah, change not. Therefore, ye, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. From the days of your fathers, ye have turned aside from mine ordinances and have not kept them. Return unto me, and I will return unto you, saith Jehovah of hosts. And this particular section gives us sort of a list of things that will be accomplished by Malachi, by my messenger. Now, here's the question that I have, though, and this is just to touch this subject that we're going to expand over the next several weeks. Here's the question. Is the messenger who prepares the way before, is that the Lord, Adon? Is that the same one? Are they the same person? And so God says, I will send my messenger, and his messenger will prepare the way before me. Question is, who's speaking? The Lord says, I will send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about prepare the way. In Hebrew, in this particular passage, in chapter 3 and verse 7, it says, and he will prepare the way. Let me back up. It's actually up closer. The root word is pana derek. Panu derek, prepare the way. Well, if we're going to figure out who the messenger is, who is going to prepare the way for Jehovah, then we have to look at other prophetic texts who give us other insights, which will help us triangulate to figure out this complexity of prophetic figures. So I want to do that. Let's begin in Isaiah 40. I have 3 passages from what we call Deutero-Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah. Let's call that from Isaiah 40 through 66. Go with me to Isaiah 40, beginning in verse 3. Now, remember a minute ago we talked about the white spaces? I'm going to pick up it. I'm going to read chapter 40, verse 3 through 5. That is sectioned off. It's separate from, it's its own unit describing something. Let's look at it. The voice of one is crying, or that crieth, prepare ye in the wilderness the way of Jehovah, make level in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill shall be made low, the uneven shall be made level, and the rough places plain. And the glory of Jehovah shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of Jehovah has spoken it. White space. The voice of one cries. Now, this verb, cries, I don't know how your translation says it. It might say crying, a voice is crying, a voice cries. The Hebrew verb here is a continued state of activity. It doesn't say a voice cried, like past tense. It doesn't say a voice will cry, like you got to pay attention because it might happen anytime. It says a voice is crying. Panu derek, kol koreh bamidbar. Panu derek Yehovah. A voice is crying in the wilderness. Panu derek Yehovah. Prepare the way. That means, according to this, if I'm quiet and we listen right now, that voice in the wilderness is crying. What's it saying? Panuderek, prepare the way. Now let's look at another text. Look at Isaiah 57. Isaiah chapter 57 and verse 14. Now here I'm just going to read one verse. And he will say, who is he? I said that. Cast ye up, prepare the way, take up the stumbling block out of the way of my people. So someone says, prepare the way. Make sure that my people don't trip. Now let's look at the last passage that deals with Panuderek. It's in Isaiah 62, verses 10 through 12. Again, separated by white spaces. This is a single unit, and here's what it says. Go through the gates, prepare ye the way of the people. Right, in Hebrew, Panuderek ha'am, prepare the way of the people. Cast up the highway, gather out the stones, lift up an ensign for the peoples. That's a whole nother study. A lot of texts talk about the lifting of an ensign. Behold, Jehovah hath proclaimed unto the end of the earth, say ye to the daughter of Zion, behold, your salvation comes. Behold, his reward is with him and his recompense before him. And they shall call them the holy people, the redeemed of Jehovah, and thou shalt be called sought out, a city not forsaken. If my messenger of Malachi chapter 3 has a job to do, and the job is to prepare the way, are these not clues? Could we not look at Isaiah chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, Isaiah chapter 57, verse 14, Isaiah 62, verses 10 through 12? Could we then not begin to describe, to present a picture of the messenger who's going to go before the Lord to prepare the way? Is the sent one, I will send my messenger of Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, is that the same that God says, I will send Elijah? In other words, is Elijah the messenger? And what about this plural group that's addressed in chapter 3 where it says, the Adon whom ye seek, the one that ye desire will suddenly come to his temple? Who is the ye? Who's he talking to? Very important studying biblical prophecy. You've got to get the context. And again, this is going to take weeks to unpack. It's job security for me. This is like I get to do this over and over, God willing, for many, many decades to come. Now, but go with me to Malachi chapter 2. Let's see who is being addressed here. Chapter 2, verse 1. And now, O ye priest, hakohanim, this commandment is for you, if you will not hear, and if you will not lay it to heart, to give glory unto my name, saith Jehovah of hosts, then will I send the curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Yea, I have cursed them already, because you do not lay it to heart. Behold, I will rebuke your seed, and spread dung upon your faces, even the dung of your feast. Ye shall be taken away with it. And you shall know that I have sent this commandment unto you, talking to the priest, that my covenant may be with Levi, saith Jehovah of hosts. My covenant was with him of life and peace, and I gave them to him that he might fear, and he feared me, and stood in awe of my name. The law of truth was in his mouth, and unrighteousness was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and uprightness, and turned many away from iniquity. For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the Torah, the law, out of his mouth. For he, who is he? The priest, is the messenger of Jehovah of hosts. Does that mean that we're looking for a priest? Could it be that a priest is actually the messenger that we're seeking? Again, we have only scratched the surface. Only scratched the surface of the complexity. What we're going to have to do is we have to decipher a web of interrelated text. You saw just an example. Panu Derek, prepare the way. Well, we need to look at all the texts that say prepare the way. Probably need to prepare some charts so that you can say, well, the messenger here is to prepare the way, and the figure in Isaiah chapter 40 and 57 and 62, maybe then we can begin to paint a picture. Because that's what it takes. We're dealing with descriptions of eschatological events and figures that are all to be coming together to produce a climactic conclusion. I mean, it requires work. The last prophetic word is a prediction of the return of all the prophets and their words that are quoted in the Gospels. Only one prophet is predicted to return, and that's Eliah. That's who we're looking for. But what else do we know about the returning prophet? A messenger with specific task. The gospel says, John, if you're willing to accept it, was Elijah. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we'll go next in next week's Sunday school. Stick around. We're going to do a discussion after class. If you're with the Yachad, you meet me in the Zoom. If you're not yet part of the Yachad, you'll just stick around and you'll be taken there automatically on YouTube to another YouTube stream. And if that doesn't happen, look in the description. There it is. Thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting with you in the after-class discussion.